He's featured scientist in the 1997 Wendy Robbins documentary on HARP, Holes in Heaven. He is currently the president and CEO of Vision Motor Cars Incorporated, designing and manufacturing affordable electric vehicles for highway use. What a bio that is. So without further ado, let's bring on today's guests. Hi, Brooks. Welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Oh, thank you very much. Good to be here.
Wow, what a bio you have. What a super interesting guest I have today, Brooke. I feel privileged.
Necessity is the mother of strange bedfellows. What can you say?
For sure. You've had quite a strange career, Brooks. I mean, I know you're an author as well. We're going to get into some of your books later, but you're not afraid to put yourself on the line and have a look at some things, Brooks. And that's unusual as a physicist. I mean, I know because I have a degree in physics, and it's mostly academic. I mean, I'm an engineer by trade, to be honest with you, but I find physics is a bit, it's a bit watertight. You're not allowed to think outside the box. Only so much, but you strike me as a guy that wants to be outside the box. You want to be on the cutting edge of things, Brooks. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, well, that's the fun part. In physics, you have to kind of draw an ideological line in the sand. It's either you're going to only collect data that agrees with your hypothesis, or you're going to collect it all, even if it takes you in another direction. And I just resolved to do the latter. I just said I'm not going to throw out data, no matter how weird it is. And, you have to classify it correctly. Sometimes it's just personal observation or opinion. But sometimes it's very, powerful information that leads you in another direction with another conclusion beside the one that you, wanted to find with your original hypothesis.
I remember that HARP documentary, Holes in Heaven. That was awesome. I remember seeing that when it came out, Brooks. And, I guess you go into Tesla technology quite a lot. I mean, that's quite cutting edge stuff too, like.
Well, it's hard not to. There's another soul that,
Wow.
just kind of went where the evidence led him, and he wasn't afraid to plug into energies that, people had, not used before. We still, to this day, really don't understand what electricity is. I mean, we know how to use it. We know how to predict it and calculate it and measure it and quantify it and pay for it, of course. But we don't really know what it is. And I think that when Tesla began coaxing electricity from whatever dimension it comes from into ours and using it to really do great things, big things, it scared people.
Yeah.
One or two great inventions, and he was a genius. After one or two, he became a crackpot, and they really had to get him out of their society because he was going somewhere where the capitalists didn't want to go.
Yeah. What a pioneer he was, Brooks. What a pioneer this man was. And like you say, genius. I think, I put him on a par with Einstein. Einstein was a genius of the physics, and he was a genius of the experimental end of things, Well,
Einstein had his limitations, and he admits them himself. He was not a great mathematician. He needed a lot of help learning mathematics after he became a physicist to explain the things that his genius mind was leading him to. For instance, he was a great theoretical physicist. He could put himself in an elevator or on a spaceship or riding on a photon somewhere, and with that perspective, really taught us how to understand and how to explore the universe. But the math to get from, to quantify time and force and mass, that he had to practice with, that he had to build on. And one of Einstein's greatest features, one of his greatest personality traits, was that he was very good in the public eye. He was kind of physics frontman for a lot of great minds, Fermi and other physicists that were more brilliant in some respects than Einstein, Max Planck and Niels Bohr. They were all great minds, but they didn't like the public eye. And so they let Einstein sort of be that public eye, and he became a very good interface for the general public with the complex ideas behind physics.
What strikes me too, Brooks, is that Tesla and Einstein were of the same era, and there wasn't much interaction, if anything. They were aware of each other, I think. But
Yeah, not at all. In fact, they were in different fields completely. Einstein was really a contemporary with Mark Twain. Mark Twain was one of his very close friends. As you know, Samuel Clemens was a great, satirist and a writer. And Nikola loved to show his newest inventions and ideas to Sam Clemens, to Mark Twain, and often used him as a kind of, human prop in some of his World's Fair demonstrations, much to Mark Twain's consternation. One time he demonstrated a subsonic beam on him at a World's Fair, and it caused Mark Twain to lose control of his bowels.
Wow.
So it was just one of those weird relationships. They were both creative souls, and they really enjoyed each other's presence.
I find it quite sad sometimes. I'm quite a humanitarian too, Brooks, and I look back in history, and I like to research the scientists, I like to know the mind behind the science and the personal life story that they had. And I feel so sad about Tesla, who he died alone in a hotel room, knowing that he, gave the world its modern perspective, all the electricity, all the lights, all the inventions. He knew he wouldn't be remembered.
It's absolutely true. Absolutely true. It is sad, and it is, he was an outcast. He was banned. He was sent to Colorado Springs, with the express understanding that we'll continue to feed you a little bit of money so that you can play out there, but you stay out of our playground, out of our sandbox. And so Westinghouse and Edison and J.P. Morgan made, unbelievable amounts of money off of connecting humanity to the grid that Tesla had created.
He was up against it with these titans, wasn't he, Brooks?
We all are. And it's a sad thing to see. And that's one of the things I do with my radio program is I go into some of the programs that are leading edge, either in genetics or in energy or in, so we call it instrumentation. And if you trace back through the grants from the universities that develop some of these ideas, it all leads to one place. It leads to a military complex. Even the movies that we see coming out of Hollywood that have to do with science fiction, the funding for those movies is so critical for these films to be able to make it to the screen, for people to be able to see them and enjoy them in the theater. And depending on what kind of special effects they have or what kind of theme they have, it takes a lot of money to make some of these movies, hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes. A lot of that money comes from the same sources. So you have to wonder, what kind of, propaganda are we being fed? If you are a creative scientist, or you have a incubator shop, or you're, bringing some great inventor, whether he's a teenager or a seasoned engineer, under your wing in your factory, and you need grant money to be able to, to experiment on things that probably won't return on an investment unless you make a really great breakthrough. Mm-hmm. That has to usually come from risk funds that are typically come from grant funds. And unfortunately, 90 to maybe close to 100% of those grants come from military sources.
Yeah, the military is 20, 30 years ahead of the actual, public domain, and I think it will always be like that, Brooks. I can't see it changing anytime soon.
People I know in that genre, what motivates them, what drives them to do this is they tell me, we have to do this. And I say, why do you have to do this? Why do you have to keep inventing something to put under that red button on your desk? And they say, because if we don't do it, our enemies will, and we'll be caught off guard. And I said, that's all well and good. I understand the philosophy behind that. But then why, when you hook it up to the red button on your desk, are you compelled to push it?
Just on the military then, and I want to talk about HARP, Holes in Heaven documentary. HARP is this facility in Alaska. Most people would probably be aware of this nowadays. I think it's now fashionable to talk about Tesla. I mean, I remember growing up and doing my electrical engineering exams and electronics as well, and it was obviously you would learn about Tesla doing that. The unit of magnetism is Tesla, but You know, back then nobody ever knew of Tesla. Now it's fashionable to talk about Tesla. But there's been a lot of documentaries, and I think he knew himself that he wouldn't be remembered for his accomplishments until like many years had passed. He even said it on his deathbed. It's strange he even envisaged that as well. But for those not familiar with HARP technology, can you tell us a little bit about HARP, and then tell us about your contribution to the Holes in Heaven documentary?
It's an interesting story. I started in 1983. I was hired by an oil company to take a technology that they had been exposed to but wasn't perfected, called ground probing radar, and to develop it as a field suitable instrument for exploring for oil in some of the world's most inhospitable areas. It had some promise. There was some Tesla technology where radio waves, clean radio waves, long wave, could be beamed into the ground. They would, of course, reflect off of all of the substrata in the ground, bouncing all over the place, and they could be picked up, those reflections, a ways off, and then they could be spectrographically analyzed because they had now been twisted all up by reflecting off various strata in the ground, and those wave patterns seemed to, at least the original inventor of it, Nikola Tesla, seemed to think that there was some indication of what the structure of the substrata might be based on those wave shapes. Well, of course, it takes a painstaking data collection. And one of the things that I had access to that Tesla did not have access to is all of the geological data from the drilling. I had the geological records from all of the wells that were drilled within, 100 miles of me as I was doing this research. So as I would go out and I would take the readings, and I developed the antenna system and the way of controlling the antennas remotely so that I could get literally quarter-degree increments, and I could get the readings and collect the wave shapes and start to do the statistics. And what I determined from that is that there were characteristic wave shapes for oil and gas and water and coal and shale and water, fresh and salt. And it became very useful information to the oil and gas industry. There were some shortcomings to it, which I overcame with other methods, collecting precision gas samples, headspace samples, and also reading and spectrifying the radiation species that were coming up through the ground. I was able to, give good analysis of what was under the ground. So I did that for 3 years, every single day, 8 hours a day, and I was about bored out of my mind, but I was making really good progress with it. And when we finished with it in the 4th year, we drilled 55 oil wells in 9 states, and we never missed. And we examined about 350 wells in that 1.5 year period. So a lot of those sites were dry, which we correctly predicted that they were dry, and the ones that ended up having oil, we were 100% correct. So the system did work. It was very repeatable. I published a paper on it, and the writers or the developers of the HARP video read that paper, and they contacted me in 1997, some years later, and said, "We would like you to contribute." So I said, sure. I looked at their data, their information, and I met Dr. Bernard Eastland, who was the one that originally penned the 7 patents that became the basis for HARP. And to tell you the truth, it scared the hell out of me. The power I was working with was up to about 50 watts. That's about all the power you can handle remotely with batteries out in the wilderness. And we were successful with it. We could take readings with it. We had some strange events happen. One time we were up in Oregon, and we turned the unit on, and 5 seconds after we turned it on, there was what felt like about a 4.5 quake occurred underneath us. And although, it could have been marked out as a coincidence, we really didn't think that we had caused that quake. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, when you're taking records, as I said, you don't throw out any data. Oh, by the way, when we turned it on, we had an earthquake. You put that in your lab notebook, and you never think anything is going to come of it. And then I see this billion-watt system in the same frequency range that I was working with ground-probing radar, with the original Tesla technology. Only they're putting so much power behind it, and they're focusing it and reflecting it off the ionosphere. I said to myself, this thing could really trigger a quake. If there's a quake ready to happen, this thing could make it happen on command, and it could steer weather around. So those were the two areas that I could offer some expertise in. Dr. Nick Begich offered the expertise on the mind control aspects of the weapon system.
Yeah, Tesla was a little bit worried about his own inventions too, wasn't he? He was very protective of, his knowledge, because he knew that it was powerful. The stuff that he was inventing or philosophizing and built this stuff in his head. I mean, he was worried what use it was going to be used for.
Well, at first he wasn't. And I would say for half of his scientific career, he was not worried at all. He was prolific. And I would say that there were several people who wore out good sets of shoes running his ideas to the patent office so they could claim credit for it. I would say Tesla did not do a good job of protecting his ideas in the beginning, but later in life, after he saw what the capitalists were doing, or I should say major corporations now, what they were doing with his technologies, then he became much more protective, and he went to his grave with many of his ideas so buried in code that no one was able to, shall I say, decipher them and share them with the general public. Yeah. But in the beginning, no, he didn't protect anything. He did come up with AC, alternating current, which was a much better way of propagating electricity over wires without line losses. However, he realized very shortly thereafter that the AC frequencies were not healthy for biological systems, and it was the DC that was much more conducive to, being around people all the time. But unfortunately, Westinghouse and JP Morgan had already taken off with the idea of metering electricity to people, and they wanted him to shut up. And so that's when they banished him to Colorado Springs. Sure.
Yeah, they controlled him really. There was a lot of control on Tesla. I mean, a lot of people don't concentrate on that, Brooks. I mean, I sometimes wonder was he naive in his early days, or?
No, he was just not a good businessman.
Yeah.
He could come up with the ideas, but he couldn't monetize them. He couldn't turn them into a house or, a lifetime of income to impress his girlfriend that he was in love with. He just couldn't turn it into money. And I run into the same thing today when we meet inventors who have ideas, and we go to them as a industrial company trying to build electric vehicles, and we say, look, your idea would be really great in our car. Here's a contract that will pay you money for your idea. And the next thing you know, they disappear. You just never hear from them again. They don't know how to turn their ideas into money. And they just don't cooperate.
Yeah, that's the art of the genius, though, isn't it? They're so genius in everything they do, but the business acumen is not there, Brooks.
True enough. They couldn't run a lemonade stand, let alone a manufacturing plant.
Exactly. They couldn't run a lemonade stand. I think, Tesla didn't care about money either. He just wanted his next invention. He was exploring his brain in a way, I think. He just wanted he just wanted enough money to do his experiments, I think, in one respect.
In those days, the stock market really wasn't what it is today. It wasn't a way that a good idea could raise money. It was a playground for the wealthy. And within 30 years, by 1890, which is, just after the world kind of got its feet after the Civil War, 1890 was a tremendous year for manufacturing. Some of the manufacturing that came along in that area just blows your mind how they just pulled great ideas out of whole cloth. But within 30 years, the great investors, had so wound up the clock spring of the economy of the world that had nowhere to go but to just spring apart like a cheap watch. Fortunately for them, they knew exactly when it was going to spring apart. They pulled their money out of the system. The whole thing came apart, and they walked in the only ones with money to put it back together again, and we're still dealing with those guys.
Oh, yeah. Without a doubt, we're still dealing with these guys. What do you think of the Wardenclyffe Tower? Do you think we'll ever rediscover what Tesla was doing with the Wardenclyffe Tower?
No, I don't know. I don't think that Tesla understood it himself. It's a little like Einstein's unified field theory. We've been battling with that theory of everything ever since, he left the public eye, probably about 3 years before he died. And I don't think we'll find it with Tesla either. But I think that it isn't important to find it. What's important is the path to finding it. It is sort of like finding the lost texts of various future-looking scriptures. We're not ready for it. If we got our hands on it now, or if the wrong people got their hands on it right now, and I don't know if the wrong people are in the Middle East or in Washington, D.C., but if the wrong people got their hands on it, it would be very bad for the earth.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get into any really alternative science books, tell us the listeners about your scientific career, and tell us about the Phoenix Science Foundation and what you do there, and give us a little bit of background about you as the scientist, as the engineer.
Well, I am naturally an Earth explorer, and I of course, made a career of it. I've worked for some of the largest corporations in the automotive industry, Toyota and General Motors. I've done lots of work for Ford and Chrysler, and I helped launch some vehicles for Nissan. So I understand that business very well. And I found that what hits the showroom typically is about 5 years old. And sometimes the technology that makes it there wasn't even the best technology that was available. So I formed Phoenix Science Foundation in 2006. I originally formed it as a nonprofit, but even though I prepared the paperwork to file with the IRS, I felt that it just brought too much of a spotlight onto the company. So even though it's filed as a nonprofit, it doesn't have its 501c3. So any money that I put into Phoenix Science Foundation, and I'd say 99% of the money comes from me, I do it just because I want to. And what Phoenix Science Foundation does is it pays for awareness. It publishes books, it publishes videos, it pays for a lot of the travel that I do, go around the world and lecture. It has never made any money. It's never designed to make any money, but it's a good place to just keep the books on what it takes to make people aware. And one of the interesting stories that I came across as I was writing the Arc of Millions of Years series with my co-author, E.J. Clark, we wrote 2,000 pages on the advent of 2012, only we wrote it with archaeological and scientific evidence that a lot of people looked at but didn't put together all in one series. And one of the pieces that we came across was the idea that planets form as hollow spheres. At first, it was probably 2001, I think, when I first came across that myself. I didn't put much stock in it. I just kind of breezed right through it. I said, wow, hollow earth. Yeah, boy, that's pretty crazy. And I put it on the shelf and didn't really think about it. And then in 2004, when the first book was published, it took us about 3 years to get the first 1,000 pages together. And then the books flowed pretty well every 2 years after that. But more data started falling into this category of hollow earth theory. And by 2005, I was so curious about it that I started to do some research on it to see what evidence had been gathered above the Arctic Circle to see if there, was an opening somewhere. And the evidence went all the way back to 1629 that I could find with Edmund Halley and various, fairly well thought of world authorities who had the idea that planets form as hollow spheres. Newton was one of them. And also a man named Marshall Gardner even patented the idea and died in 1965, I guess, of pneumonia on one of the treks. And then in my own genealogy, I discovered that one of my ancestors was Sir James Ross, who was the discoverer of the North Magnetic Pole. And he almost died the first time that he went out. Wow. His ship got caught in the ice and crushed into splinters. He and his crew, of course, got off the boat, stayed on the ice with their, resources, their food and tents and everything, and they survived, and the ships came and got them, and then he went again, and this time he discovered it. So it's kind of in my blood, you might say. And so I went looking for an expedition to join. I didn't know if we were going to be running behind Huskies or flying on a helicopter, but I found this group out in Utah, who's led by Stephen Curry, that was going to go on a ship on a nuclear-powered icebreaker. So I joined the crew, and I was on the team to build the gyroscope. You have to measure the curvature of the Earth so you know actually when you're sailing into what was theoretically called the oceanic depression. It was a place where sea level isn't sea level, so to speak. It appeared in several maritime records going all the way back to the mid-1600s.
Wow.
And even one retired colonel, a Navy colonel who did several submarine tours under the polar ice caps, and one rear admiral who had retired, who also confirmed that they have areas in the sea that they also call the oceanic depression, a place where sea level is about 1,000 feet lower than it is elsewhere in the sea. And I asked them, what do you think causes that? And the submarine guy, who I'll call Kurt, did not have any idea, but the rear admiral said, well, we believe those are areas on the planet where gravity is just extra high and it pulls the water down deeper, to a lower, closer area to the crust.
Doesn't make sense, though. That doesn't even make sense. That's just like...
Well, I quizzed him out about it. I said, well, do you think it could be an area on the planet where maybe gravity is less than it is elsewhere on the planet? And the surrounding gravity is actually pulling the sea away from that area, leaving that depression. He said, wow, I never thought about it like that, but that's an idea too. So that would support the idea that at least somewhere on the sea bottom, there's an opening through the crust, someplace where, gravity isn't as intense. We know that gravity is more intense, where mountains are than where there are valleys, because we can measure it. So that's why I was saying it that way, that there might be a great valley in the ocean where gravity is less. So we started out with it, and no sooner did I join the crew, about 7 months later, Stephen Curry, very unfortunately, suddenly passed away. Rapid onset brain cancer. I spoke to him in November. In May, he was gone. So in September, they elected me to be the new expedition leader, which I held that position until November of last year, when I resigned, because I have to do other things with the company, and I can't give the project the time that I want to, so I gave up the leadership. But I still support it, and would still love to participate in that expedition.
So I'm just going to say the website for the expedition is NPIEE. That's the North Pole Inner Earth Expedition. Brooks, where's that state at today? What's the state of play for today for the expedition? Because
we are working with we were working with National Geographic Channel, and the crew, not National Geographic, but the crew that was doing the production moved over to Discovery Channel. So we're now working with Discovery Channel to put together all the evidence that we've collected so far, because we've traveled to Mexico and Tibet and China and Nepal, all over the United States, including Mammoth Cave and we've just kind of followed the legend wherever it led us around the planet. And we've put together a sizable amount of data that leads us to a place where we really don't have an answer. What we have is a giant question that we can't answer. And that's a beautiful setup for science. That's what we like. We don't like to have things so cut and dry that we already know all the answers. What we like is evidence that leads us someplace where we cannot figure it out. Then we start developing experiments, which we invite to come on this ship with us. And when the time is right, we will sail up there, perform the experiments, and tell the world what we find.
So let's get into some of the science, leaving Nippy for a second. Let's get into some of the science, the seismology and the geology and the earth science, Brooks. I mean, there's this depression in the earth that we know. I mean, there was flyovers over the pole. This, like you say, there's some historical reference for this, but scientifically, there's like seismology and geological data as well.
Yeah, we have this theory that is taught to geology students everywhere. I saw it in my geology books. I still have it. I still have the books. And that is that when there's an earthquake on one side of the planet, let's say over on the South Pacific atolls, there's a sharp quake, say a 7.5. It thumps the planet, and those vibrations pass through the globe and are picked up by other listening stations around the planet. And we kind of do an MRI, a CAT scan of the Earth. As we gather those timings of those vibrations, we can look at the inside of the Earth. It is, of course, interesting to oil and gas companies because it saves them the trouble of having to go blast something somewhere to make the same kind of vibration that nature does all by itself. Unfortunately, they have this idea that they force into the data that we live on a molten ball of iron in space, and we exist on the surface of this molten ball on tectonic plates like cornflakes floating around in a bowl of milk. And yeah, it moves very slowly, but nevertheless, we can see the edges of these plates, and we know that they're moving around. And we just make an assumption that the planet's more or less solid all the way through. Liquid in some places, but no real voids inside of it. And then when you look at this thing from a cross-disciplinary point of view, that is to say, you take the seismology that I just mentioned with these vibrations going through the Earth, and then you take the spectroscopy, which is a spectrographic way of looking at the vibrations that come out of the center of the Earth, which the Japanese did a very good job of year before last. And this last year, two female scientists out of Boston, MIT, did a wonderful job at finding the frequency and the temperature of the core of the Earth. And what they came up with is that the Earth is probably pure iron. In fact, it's an iron crystal, and it's not molten at all. It's under high pressure, and it was originally thought that the core was at somewhere around 5,000 degrees C, which is significant. That's hot. It's not as hot as the sun, but it's hot. But these individuals, these two women scientists, resolved that the actual temperature of the crust is more closely to 6,000 degrees C. And the reason that's significant is that's just about the same temperature as the surface of the sun. Wow. And although we don't have a fusion reaction going on inside of our planet because we're not turning hydrogen into helium down there, this is the temperature of that iron under that pressure, which means that this core that we have inside the planet is probably part of the original compression of Earth when it formed. Wow. And then when we compare that to the data where we look at the actual continents of the planet, we see the continental shelves of the planet, how they all fit together. Any third grader can see that. We had a primitive idea that all of the continents were together on one side of the planet. We called it Pangea. We called it Gondwana land. But it was very quickly shot down because the outside of these land masses also fit together, not just the inside. So it's sort of like too few puzzle pieces for too large of a puzzle space. And what one scientist did, his name is Neil Adams, he just compressed the puzzle space. He shrunk the planet Earth to about 1/3 its present size, and guess what? All the continental shelves fit together perfectly. Wow. Everything, all sides, which meant that if Earth had as much water as it does now, that the entire planet, except for the very highest mountains, would have been submerged underwater. And, of course, somebody said, well, if that was true, then we'd have sedimentary layers from these continents being underwater for millions of years in all the highest mountains. And guess what? We do. And it's not because the mountains pushed up out of the water. It's because the planet expanded as it was going from its, primordial birth to its more cool and stable present state. And the seas simply receded into the lower lying areas, which we know as oceans. But if that was the case, then the geological age of the sea bottom would be radically different than that of dry land. And guess what? It is, by several billion years.
Wow.
It is really remarkable how all of this cross-disciplinary data fits together to lead us to a question. Is there or is there not a void underneath the crust of our planet?
So if we have this inflatable Earth theory, I mean, it's got to inflate because whatever that reason is, maybe, pressures, that crystal inside the Earth doing something. You think then there's a hollow where it has inflated for?
Well, obviously, if the crust is moving away from the core, and we have some ideas based on these vibrations that we've been measuring from the seismology, that the crust is somewhere between 800 and 900 miles thick. Then this core, which is somewhere around 12 to 1,500 miles in diameter, this solid iron crystal, when you do the math, you're left with about 1,200 miles of open space, unaccounted for.
Wow. This is mind-blowing, Brooks. This is mind-blowing stuff.
Well, there's other data. There's space-based data. We had theories come back to us that there's a point of equilibrium, equidistance, shall I say, between the Earth and the Sun. Actually, between any two orbiting bodies, one orbiting around the other.
Lagrange points.
And, Lagrange points. Now, this is a point at which you're neither pulled toward either one of the bodies. It's a point of peaceful equilibrium between the two bodies. And that should have a mathematical pinpoint, exactly equidistance between the gravitational center of those two bodies. Well, it's 1,200 kilometers off for Earth. It's not in the center of our planet. It's somewhere around 1,200 kilometers toward the surface, which would be a point between the core and the crust.
Wow. This is rock solid math, isn't it? Lagrangian mathematics is rock solid, Brooks. This is like...
well, we've measured it from space. We have geosynchronous satellites 23,500 miles out in space that have been there, since the late 70s. And we know these numbers within a meter.
Wow, this is fascinating, Brooks. The mind is just boggling here. This stuff, like. Okay, so Brooks, if you go to the North Pole, I mean, we know that there's only 2 ships that can make it up there, the Russian icebreakers. What would you go up there to do? You would try and get the circular depression at the poles, or, atmospheric data as well. Would there be many scientists up there doing all sorts?
The best experiments, the very best. You make your plans and you decide what you're going to do. You make your roadmap, as it were.
Very interesting.
And what happens is once you pull away from the dock, everything changes. There's no extension cord. There's no resupply line. There's no way to look at it again and say, oops, I think we have another idea now. We need to go back to the dock and get another piece of equipment. So we're making the best guess we can as to what we might see. And we're trying to be prepared for everything. We're trying to build this 110-person team with the right people to be able to look at the right data. So we don't one day, although there's no nighttime in the summer up there, one day you don't look out and say, what's that? And everybody on the team says, I don't know. We need somebody on the team to go, I know what that is. So that's hard to put together.
You only get one chance at this as well, Brooks, don't you? You can't turn back. This is an extremely difficult place to get to.
Well, it is not that hard to sail to, I don't think, because this is a 73,000 ton icebreaker. It's used to this kind of stuff, but it is so expensive to put together. It's pretty close to $3 million to put this expedition together. And we've been trying for almost 6 years now to raise the money to do this. It's more than I can afford. And, you know, even if I am successful with what I'm doing with the company, I can't afford it. But, and we have had no benefactors step forward, and we've tried to do several fundraisers, which have been, you know, an exercise in futility, actually. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't happen. Well, I'm not, a naysayer, and I never give up, but I just didn't have the wherewithal to keep putting that many hours in it week after week and still be able to run a company. So we're hoping that
for donations. Take a minute to give out your websites there, and give out the radio station that you do as well, Brooks. Give us out your websites there.
Yeah, Sunday evenings, actually tonight at 8 p.m., we are live for 3 hours at X Squared Radio. You can just Google X Squared Radio. We have archives available on the BBS radio network, and we're live on the Truth Frequency network. And we do take calls, and we talk about these subjects as well as, you know, many provocative subjects of the day. We try to take as scientific a look as we can at information. And a lot of that information in the last few months has been to do with this tremendous economic imbalance that we see on our planet. And we try to get to the root of it and where the math leads us, where the numbers lead us. And it's been so remarkable, the response that we're getting from the audience. Like, holy cow, somebody's finally looking at this and really pulling back the curtain and showing who the man behind the curtain is.
Wow. Yeah, I love science radio shows, Brooks. I mean, I try to dabble a bit in it myself, but mostly history, Egyptology, science. I like to keep everybody interested, but it's nice to see another radio show. I can't wait to tune in, Brooks, because I've only just found it, so I'm looking forward to it. You mentioned the iron crystal, Brooks. Just want to go back to that. Do you think then that this iron crystal, this big giant iron crystal inside the Earth, would be, I think people have talked about it being a cosahedron or something like that, and would that be a proponent for this Earth grid theory that, you know, there would be points or nodal points on the Earth crust that would be more energetic, and that's where all these ancient civilizations built their monuments?
We've had a long look at this, and what we have found is that many ancient civilizations, Mayan, certainly Egypt, the alignment of those buildings with Sirius and that star system are within a half arc second. That's no accident. You just don't go out in the desert and align a complex of buildings in a star system shape and align it so well that it stays aligned for 11,000 years. It's just not by accident. Not only that, but we also found that the ley lines that go up through the United Kingdom, several places in Europe, there are complexes of buildings and spirit centers built on those. That's no accident either. We found in the oddest places, way up in north of Alberta, Canada, and also in the doggone Indian ancient relics that they assembled, that they appear to have had a knowledge of the arrangement of the planets around our sun. And that's remarkable because we didn't even discover Pluto until, the early 60s. Mm-hmm. We think we're so smart. Mm. The interesting thing about these two complexes is they appear to have a knowledge of our solar system from the outside in, not from the sun out.
Yeah, the other way around.
The observation point was the other way. Mm. If you look at Earth from Mars, it shows up nicely, a nice blue kind of star sitting out there. Mm-hmm. And I would say that if you get within, let's say 65 million miles of our sun, or anywhere of the plane of our solar system, you're going to notice the Earth. It's going to show up as a remarkable planet. In fact, if I was a galactic explorer, mm-hmm. or I was a member of the science crew of that ship, I would be looking for the wavelength of light made by water on the surface of a planet. Yes. And that's why Earth is so remarkable.
Like a blue
If we
beaky.
ever come to terms with the idea of, subspace travel, not where we jump in an aluminum can and accelerate it to, 500,000 miles an hour and then sit in it for 85 years until we arrive at our destination, which we don't even know is there. If we ever come to terms with the idea that we can actually travel large distances of time across the galaxy in a blink, then I think we'll realize that we're not the only ones here.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, we would have this little blue beacon, this little blue twinkle of light, it's like, I'm open to this whole, I do some shows on ufology too, and, I'm open to this, like, look at the Dogon tribe, they're fascinating in themselves, like, these guys are writing about star beings and stuff, who knows if we have our origins, outside the cosmos and, as you say, coming inwards, like, but, just on the Hollow Earth, I just want to tidy up on that. I mean, tell us a little bit about the history of this. I mean, I've done a bit of research on it from just previous years, Brooks. But I mean, what do you think of Admiral Byrd? Because people, there's for and against for what he, some people say it's fiction, some people say it's history, some people say he was doing military operations somewhere else. He flew over the poles. I mean, I'm a little confused on that myself, like. But what do you think of Admiral Byrd's testimony?
Well, I think where the controversy comes from is what people say was his testimony. Right. He was a Navy admiral. He was a super patriot. And anybody that gives that much of their life, that much of their career to the defense of the Constitution of the United States of America is going to keep his mouth shut if the government tells him to keep his mouth shut. The fact that he flew across the North Pole in 1926 and the South Pole in 1929 and ostensibly participated in a military operation called Operation Paperclip in 1945, where he he led a post-war, highly trained, battle-hardened men expeditionary force to the Antarctica to try to eliminate a latent Nazi threat that might have escaped Germany with some of their higher technology, and came home basically with their tail between their legs licking their wounds. I think all of that can be pretty factually backed up. But there are a couple of what people are calling Admiral Byrd's diaries floating out there, and I've read one of them which was extensive and another one which was fairly short. And my personal opinion is they are not genuine. I followed all the way back as far as I could, and I've talked to people who say that they have seen the originals, but I still do not have enough information to validate those sources. And it's those sources that get so fictional that you really have a hard time putting any credibility in it. The fact that his airplane, or the observation that his airplane was grabbed by some kind of tractor beam, that he was taken inside the planet, that he met all kind of giant beings, highly intelligent, and all of that is nonsense. None of that was his original observation. All he said was that he flew up there, and he said that he looked down and saw green grass and liquid water where none should have been. And that was his, and from there, it just took off. And if you think there are esoteric communities today, you should see the way they were in the early 1900s.
Yeah, sure. Do we have any satellites that go over the North and South Pole that could photograph? Never mind airplanes.
We do. There are satellites that go high up and can easily see the poles. And when the internet first started really getting out there, I'd say 1996, 1997, some of this data from the early 1968 pictures that came back started to float around on the web. And it started a firestorm because the observations of the North Pole clearly show this nice, neat, blacked out area at the pole.
Wow.
The truth is that the images that are taken by these satellites, especially the one in 1968, doesn't have a big field of view. So it has to be stitched together in film strips. And when they stitch the strips together, they meet somewhere around, the 85th, 87th parallel. Mm-hmm. And that's it. You can't, the strips are so narrow at that point that you just don't get an image. So, that's why that 1968 photograph looks that way. But I went through more than 10,000 of those. Wow. And I never saw the North Pole or the Arctic regions without cloud cover. So they were pretty useless, and they were black and white. Now, today we do have satellites that go over that area, but in 2006, the Data Denial Act was passed, which was a joint act between the European community and the U.S., which we run all of the weather satellites, at least from that time forward. And that Data Denial Act said that they will publish no data above the 60th parallel, because it gives information that can be used for imagery for cruise missiles. So they don't publish that data at all. So there are no publicly available images of the Arctic region. And I have people call me all the time and write me emails and send me YouTubes. Oh my gosh, you need to see this thing on Google Earth. Yeah. Well, I'm here to tell you, Google Earth, everything above the 60th parallel is animated. It is not real. Wow.
We live in a alien nightmare. Watch out for big brother. Watch out for big brother. We live in a alien nightmare. Watch out for big brother. Watch out for big brother.